Hi, I'm Norm Abram. Welcome to the New Yankee Workshop. Today we're going to build a couple of racks. They could be used to display a quilt or dry the laundry. They're fun to build, they don't take very much material, and they make great gifts. I'll show you where we started our research next, right here on the New Yankee Workshop.
The New Yankee Workshop features the craftsmanship of Norm Abram.
Old Sturbridge Village in central Massachusetts is a great place to visit if you love old buildings as much as I do. And the furniture collection inside is extraordinary. They also have an extensive collection of decorative arts from the period. For instance, there are over 200 quilts from the early 19th century and some wonderful wooden racks to display them. Let me show you. Sarah LeCount is the curator of textiles here at the museum. Hi, Sarah.
Hello.
This is a beautiful quilt. What can you tell me about it?
This quilt was made in the late 1830s by a woman from central Massachusetts who cut apart 12,000 pieces of fabric and sewed them back together again.
12,000 pieces, wow. And they're all different patterns. Where did she get all the fabric?
Printed fabric like this was coming out of England and France in great waves. Also, American printed fabric companies were putting out good quality products like this by this time.
Now, I see you have another quilt over here on a wooden rack.
This is an earlier quilt from our collection, probably dating to the 1790s. You can see that the use of fabric is very different, with the larger blocks put in very squarely.
Now, was it common in the period to display quilts on racks like this?
Quilts in the period were meant to be used, so if they were displayed, it would be on a bed. We're using towel racks to show these to the audience today. This is another towel rack placed next to our wash basin, as it might have been in the past.
Oh, finally some wood. Well, you know, I can definitely build this, but the quilt, no way.
You'd be surprised, Norm. More and more men are getting into quilting. You might want to give it a try.
I don't think so. Hand me my nail gun. In addition to my visit to Old Sturbridge Village, I looked through several antique books we have here at the shop, looking for examples of quilt racks. Turns out they're rare, just as the people from Old Sturbridge had told me. It's a modern-day invention. So I had to come up with my own design. And this is what I ended up with. A quilt rack that's sort of Victorian in style, made from mahogany. It has a leg which comes down to the floor that's been mortised into this post, which is a nice turning that leads up to this heavy piece at the top, which is connected by two simple dowels to support the quilt. Down at the bottom, another turned piece, which is the stretcher to connect the legs. Now over here is a piece that couldn't be simpler, and I did find this in one of my books. It's a shaker drying rack, and it comes from Mount Lebanon, New York, made of pine with through mortises and cherry wedges to hold it all together. And those wedges are really going to show up nicely when the finish is applied. The whole rack is supported by a trestle-like foot. Now, if you'd like to build either one of these racks, a measure drawing is available with the materials list, and you'll hear more about that before this program ends. Let's get started today by building the Victorian rack. The first pieces that I want to make are the vertical posts. I need to have a blank that's the exact finished length, and that's 1 5/8 inches square. The first thing to do is to locate the center line. I could just place a line from corner to corner, but there's a gadget for everything. This little plastic piece has a lip on it that slips over the side of the blank, and I draw one line from these corners and then one from this corner, and that gives me the exact center of the blank. The next thing to do is take an awl and punch a hole at the center, one on each end. And this will allow me a starting point for the parts of my lathe. The first thing to do is to take the drive center and set it in the pre-punched hole and drive the spurs into the piece of wood. Now, I use a rubber mallet so I won't damage my drive center. Then I take the assembly, slip the drive center back into the lathe, and then set the other end of the blank with the cup center. And just squeeze that in, turn it a little bit to set it, and tighten it in place. Then I want to check it for balance. But before I turn it on any power tools, let's have a word about shop safety. be sure to read, understand, and follow all the safety rules that come with your power tools. Knowing how to use your power tools properly will greatly reduce the risk of personal injury. And remember this, there is no more important safety rule than to wear these safety glasses. Now let's just check it for balance. At the slowest speed, we'll turn it on. And that seems pretty good. All right, now the next thing is that when you do a turning that ends up with a square portion at one end, often you'll get chipping right here at the beginning of the square part. To help prevent that, I like to take my little dovetailing saw and come to each corner and just make a little saw cut, maybe about 1/4 of an inch deep. Okay, now we're ready to do some turning. I think it's a very good idea to wear a full face mask when doing any turning work. The first tool that I'm going to use is a gouge, sort of a scoop-shaped tool. And I want to round the piece from the saw cut all the way to the end. So what I want to do is slide the tool rest into position about 1/8 of an inch away and parallel to the piece. Lock it in place and we're ready to go. Okay, now I've got it nice and round the entire length. Now what I'm going to do is take the turning that I've already made, or you could use a cardboard pattern of the turning, and mark each of the transition areas, these flat spots, and on each side of these beads. And then what I'm going to do is use a parting tool to bring them down to the diameter that I want. Okay. Now I can set my caliper to my turning that I've already made and keep taking away material until it fits on the new blank. All right, with all the critical diameters turned to the right dimension, I now can complete the turning. And to aid in that process, I've taken one of the completed turnings and mounted it on this floor stand and set it right in front of the piece I have to complete. Now, I'm not talking about making an absolute identical copy of this, just close. To make all the rest of the turnings, I'm going to use a variety of gouges and maybe even a scraper. I want to start in the center here, completing this little ball. Okay, I'd say we're pretty close right here in the middle. The next thing I want to do is turn these two little beads. And to do that, I'm going to use the smallest gouge that I have. Okay, now that's pretty good. The next thing to do is to complete the straight section between those two beads, and I'll just move to a larger gouge. Okay, now using my scraper, I just completed the tenon which will go into the upper part of the quilt rack. Now all I have to do is sand the turning. Okay, that takes care of the post. Now once you've mastered the techniques necessary to turn this piece, you can also do the turning for the stretcher, just a slightly different design. Now, the dowels that connect the two upper pieces couldn't be easier. Okay, well that takes care of turning the dowel. Now let's take a look at how the feet fit into that post. There's a through mortise, and the feet have tenons that just slide in. And the next thing that I want to do is make that mortise in the post I turned earlier. Of course, there are several ways to make a mortise. The traditional way might be to drill it out with a hand drill and then square it up with a chisel. I could also use a mortising attachment over at my drill press. But the best alternative here in the workshop is this single station tool meant only for mortising. I've installed the 1/2-inch size chisel, which is hollow, so that a bit can pass through it. The bit will remove most of the material, and the chisel will square it up. I also have a fence, which I can adjust to position the exact location of the mortise. Okay, that takes care of the post for now. Let's start working on the legs. Here's a cardboard layout of the leg pattern. But I don't want to cut the shape of the leg first. I want to make the tenon first, which is at a 45-degree angle to the edge of the blank. I'll start forming the tenon at the miter box, which I'll swing to 45 degrees and just trim off the corner. The next thing to do is make the shoulder cuts for the tenon. And to do that, I've set up a gauge block. I'm using my miter gauge, which has been set to a 45-degree angle. And because this piece is short and I'm cutting at a 45-degree angle, I'm using these clamp downs to hold it secure. To make the cheek cuts for the tenon, I'm using my tenoning jig. It allows me to clamp the piece in place securely with the cut edge flat to the table, and I've adjusted it side to side to make the cheek cut closest to the jig first. Now I've made an adjustment to the tenoning jig, moving it slightly this way so that I can make the cheek cut on the other side of the tenon. Well, now I can trace the pattern of the leg, holding it even with the shoulder of the tenon. I'll just trace the outline. Now over to the bandsaw, where I can cut it out. Now there are a couple spots that the drum sander can't reach. A little hand sanding will clean up those areas. Now a couple more cuts at the bandsaw will complete the tenon. Now to ease the edges of each foot, I'm using my router, which I've set up with a 1/4 inch, quarter round bit, but I've only extended the bit partially below the base plate. Now with the 2 feet tightly fitted but not glued into the post, I want to drill a 3/4 inch hole, 3/4 of an inch deep for the stretcher. The last 2 pieces to make are the ones that sit on top of the post and are connected by the dowels. I've done the layout on my blank with another piece of poster board, and the first thing I want to do is drill a hole in the underside for the post. It's a lot easier to do that before I cut the shape because it gives me a nice solid surface to rest it on. After changing to a 7/8 inch diameter bit, I'm now drilling holes for the dowels. Well, now we'll just glue all the pieces together, clamp it, and let it sit overnight. Then tomorrow we'll put the finish on this piece, and it'll build that nice little shaker rack. Well, all it took was 1 clamp to hold the assembly together while the glue dried. And it's amazing how sturdy this piece is. I'm sure it'll hold our heaviest quilt. Now I'm ready to take it into the finishing room and put on a couple coats of Danish oil. But in the meantime, let's get started building the shaker towel rack. The first piece I want to make is the trestle foot. Here's all the stock I'll need to build the towel rack. About $6 of sugar pine if you had to go out and buy it. I was fortunate to have enough scrap hanging around the shop. Now here's the blanks for the feet. We'll cut those at the bandsaw. Now with a 5/16 inch chisel in my mortiser, I've made the mortise for the post. Now using my router with a chamfering bit, I'm just easing the edges at the top of the foot. Now we can start working on the posts. Each one has 2 through mortises for the stretchers. So I've readjusted my mortiser and we'll drill those out. Where the post meets the trestle foot, I need to form a tenon. So I've set up my table saw with a stop block to set the distance of the shoulder cut, and I'll just nibble away the material. Okay, let's try the fit. That's good. By moving my rip fence a little closer to the blade, I was able to make a tenon that's a little bit shorter, and that's going to fit into this cross piece at the top, a piece that we'll make next. Now the mortise in the cross piece is a through mortise. Now what I want to do is make a small tenon on each end to receive the top members of the rack. Okay, that takes care of the through mortises for this intersection. The kerf cut that I just made is to receive the cherry wedge. All the tenons need a kerf cut except for the ones that go into the trestle feet. To cut those wedges, I first take a piece of scrap plywood and slip it around the blade. Otherwise, the wedges will fall through the slot in the table. Then I just freehand them. Okay, now we're ready for a little assembly. Glue on the tenon and in the mortise. There's no brads or screws, just a little glue. Well, now for the cherry wedges. They're what really hold this joint together. Now the original had pine wedges. I chose the cherry because when I trim them off and finish the piece, they're going to look real sharp. Now it's not a bad idea to check everything for squareness before the glue sets. Now before I trim the wedges and sand everything flush, I'll set it aside to dry for a couple hours. Now with the tenon and the cherry wedge sanded flush, you can really see how the cherry stands out. Next stop, a couple coats of polyurethane. In a can, I've added a little wild cherry stain to my Danish oil. And that's to darken the mahogany a bit. I applied one coat, which I let sit on there for about 30 minutes. This is the second coat, which I'll leave on for 15 minutes and then wipe off any excess. Of course, the more coats I apply, the better it's going to look. Well, a couple coats of satin finish polyurethane will protect the wood from any damp laundry, and it really brings out those cherry wedges and the end grain tenons. Boy, my wife has been after me for the longest time to build one of these. Finally a way to display her favorite quilt.